wanted to talk about a few kind of specific scenarios that people have asked me about, and I think that might be good to go into because it'll help us kind of frame some discussion here. So the first scenario I want to talk about is just the idea of sort of allowing different kinds of content on your site. Suppose, here's your scenario. I have a web page. I need to host various kinds of content, maybe different kinds of widgets that I don't maybe know what they are, ads that come from the ad network that I'm not really quite sure what they are either. Maybe this is all using Java, Flash, Silverlight, various number of different kinds of RIA technologies. So the question is, I don't want to learn about all these different plugins. Like, it would take a lot of time to go sort of learn everything I need to know about this stuff. So what do I need to know just to make sure these components are kind of isolated and safe from each other? And the good news here is that the same origin policy applies. So if all these different widgets are hosted on different domains, then by default, everything is kind of isolated. And this is kind of the iframe model, right? This is the model web developers generally expect. If I have a page and I have iframes to a whole bunch of different domains, they're by default isolated, right? They can't talk back and forth between that frame boundary. So the nice thing about RIA plugins is that we tend to follow this model by default. Well, not even tend to, we do follow this model by default. Due to the point that if you find a way that we don't follow that model by default, like that's when you send mail to secure@microsoft.com, right? Like that's something that's important, and it's Peleus and my job to kind of make sure that we make sure it holds true as much as possible. So that's kind of where we start, and if you can do that, great. But it's not always so simple. I think Peleus' example of the ad that needs to fly across the screen, which is getting more and more common, it seems like, by the way. To do that, you need some level of DOM access. You can't really just be this little island of Flash or Silverlight that is kind of in the nice little rectangle that can't break out. So that gets a little tricky. So specifically, we need to think about plugins that have DOM access switched on, or plugins that have access to your domain via some kind of cross-domain policy file. Those are kind of the key two. And then we can start thinking about kind of these other channels of communication. So as we mentioned, HTTP access. Flash, Silverlight, and Java all support some level of sockets. And this is controlled through some kind of policy file as well. So that's another thing to keep in mind. Another kind of lesser known, I think, technology both present in Silverlight and Flash is the ability for plugins to talk to each other via this kind of a shared memory mechanism. And that can be a nice channel for ads because they don't have to necessarily go through the DOM. So a lot of times if you have like one ad at the top and another banner ad, they're able to kind of communicate between themselves without having DOM access. So that's actually kind of one nice way you can solve some of these problems without having to turn on the DOM. But that's another point of communication as well. It is domain scope by default as well. If you're noticing a theme here, yeah. Like the domain is kind of the is important here, and a lot of these things are domain scope. Cookies, of course, most of us know that that's important to keep those safe. DOM access we talked about. Another thing to think about is, can the application navigate the top level page? We've seen some kind of malicious ads that kind of get into ad networks by mistake, and if they can sort of automatically navigate the top level page to malware.com or some other bad site, that can be a problem. Or suppose, here's another scenario. What if you have a RIA where maybe you have a specific RIA, you're not just plugging in an ad network. Maybe you have some Swift or Zap sitting around that maybe you lost the source code for. Maybe you don't know, maybe some partner's helping you develop it and you don't know exactly what it does. Maybe you need to, maybe there's some kind of way for users to extend the web experience, right? The nice thing about the fact that they're easier to compile is that makes them kind of more scannable as well. And this is something there is some tooling support for on the web if you go out and look for this kind of thing. But I just called out a few examples of things you can do. I think a lot of times what you'd want to do here is look and see specifically what APIs the plugin is calling. But there is sort of, and I have Silverlight specific examples here, but there are some kind of gotchas in terms of dynamic things that can happen. So what if you need like a page with secured access to something? What if you had some kind of banking site or some other thing where the data was sensitive and you need to make sure you're really protected against man in the middle? So we've all browsed to a site that's SSL encrypted. We got the nice lock icon, but maybe suddenly the little warning pops up about mixed content, right? Oh, some of the stuff on the page is not encrypted. What do you want to do? You want to look at the page? I think we all just click yes, right? And usually this is benign enough. Usually it's like images or something. They're kind of expensive to serve up over HTTPS, so it might just be hitting some HTTP server somewhere. But if you're loading a RIA app that way, that's not too cool, right? The man in the middle can easily replace that file. If that RIA has DOM access, then the bad man in the middle basically owns your page. So that's one important thing to keep in mind as well if you're using SSL. So another thing to think about here is it's not just about the plugin attacking the page when we talk about these cross-domain DOM threats. But there's also the possibility of the page actually attacking the RIA. So if you're writing a RIA app, when you're calling out to the page, make sure that you're doing so in a way that making sure you don't trust that data too much. Or if you do, set up some kind of way to make sure you're being loaded in the right environment. Sometimes we call that site locking, to make sure this app should only be loaded on this site. Let's verify that before we do anything else. And if you don't, if you're taking information for the page and just making important decisions based on that, there's potentially a trust boundary there, and you need to keep that in mind. Cool. So the other scenario I want to talk about is allowing arbitrary user uploads to your site. So the scenario here is, imagine I'm running some site where I want my users to be able to upload files to my server. Sounds nice. It sounds very cloudy. I have some web apps on that domain too to help do stuff, whatever. And I don't really want to have separate domains. It's kind of a hassle. Can I allow users to upload files to the same domain without risking my web apps? Well, as Peleus mentioned earlier, all these technologies do have special access to the sites and the domains from which they were loaded. So if I'm able to get my evil Zap or Swift or Jar or whatever onto your website, that means I can make requests back to that domain pretty easily. I can just load that Zap from evil.com and have special access back to your domain. So that's kind of a problem. Best practice for this scenario in general is, if at all possible, you should really be hosting this stuff on a different top-level domain that doesn't get mixed in with your other web app logic. Yeah, if you're really paranoid, even make it a different top-level domain. There's been some bugs in the past where even subdomains haven't been quite enough. So one cool attack here that I believe is attributed to Billy Rios, which he called the GIFAR attack, is in this scenario. So imagine I'm running a server where I want to allow users to upload arbitrary images, right? Not that far-fetched. It's kind of imagine Flickr, right? So Billy found a way to construct a file that's a valid GIF, but also a valid jar, which is a Java applet. And here's kind of a high-level view of how this works. GIF, is based on data kind of from the beginning, and I believe the jar archive, I believe the way that works is that the index is actually at the end of the file. So he's able to actually make this kind of cool GIFAR file that if you upload to a domain, and if the domain runs checks on it, it will say, oh, this is a valid GIF, this is fine to put on my domain, but in fact, they're kind of opening up these cross-domain privileges they didn't realize. So that's pretty cool. This has been fixed. So I just wanted to point out that there's kind of an interesting hypothetical corollary here for Silverlight. As I mentioned, Silverlight is a zip file. So is a Word document. The docx is. So I believe AIR files are zips, PK, and then blah. So I haven't done this, but it should be fairly easy to construct a file that's a valid Silverlight app, that's a valid Word document, and a valid AIR application.
That's right.
Okay. Anyways, so if I'm trying to allow if I'm some kind of SharePoint-y thing and I just want to allow arbitrary docx's to be uploaded to my site, You know, that's